I'm Liz Charter. I'm the chairman of the Isle of Man Fungus Group. I've also worked for DAF and then DEFA as an ecologist, and now I'm involved in this Manx Nature Alliance as a partner.
Nick Pinder, I'm records officer with the Manx Bat Group, formerly director of the Wildlife Park and also first person in charge of the Wildlife Act.
Hello, I'm Philippa Tomlinson and I'm an ecologist. I work as a ecological consultant. I used to look after the island's biological records for many years.
We are here to have a chat today about a new organisation, the Manx Nature Alliance, MNA for short, presumably, an alliance of nature-based organisations, professional ecologists, as we've got the hint from your own descriptions there, set up to act as an independent, united voice. First off, why, and I'll throw this open to anyone or all of you, as the case may be, why did you feel there was a need to set up the Manx Nature Alliance?
Because we feel nature has fallen down government's agenda. In recent years, they've publicly announced various positions and by the biodiversity strategy adopted by Tynwald, but as far as we can see, there's very little progress towards achieving any of the statements in there, and it seems to be getting worse and worse, and various positions in departments are not being filled when people leave. In some instances, the climate crisis and even plastics seems to have taken over government's attention, and they put more resources into that and left nature, abandoned it almost.
Liz, any thoughts on the actual setting up?
Yes, the idea has been around for a little while that we needed to get people together. There are diverse organisations with nature conservation at the top of their agenda, but it seemed the time is right now to speak with a single voice and amplify our individual messages to get the message across that we cannot ignore the ecological crisis, that even Tynwald unanimously voted that there was an ecological emergency, and yet we see no sign that this is really impinging on any priorities within government.
And why do you think that is? Do you think then it is because, as you say, it's been on the agenda for a long time? Is it, as we all know, we're in fairly straitened times at the moment? Look at pretty much any government department, they're all trying to make savings. Is this the nub of it? It's a case of, oh, well, yes, it is very important, but at the moment we've got bigger fish to fry when it comes to budgets for departments.
A while back, when there was an economic crisis after the crash of 2008, that was when spending on biodiversity went down, and it's never picked up again, whereas other things have done. And there has been funding out there, but it's as if nobody's really taking any interest in it. And you have to look at it as a global perspective. There's a global biodiversity crisis, and it's affecting the Isle of Man just as much as everywhere else. We want to educate people. We want to find out more about what is going on and make sure that government's aware of what their obligations are and what should be done, because it's really urgent.
And do you think that part of the problem is the fact that we are, without a doubt, not just on the Isle of Man, but I think globally, or certainly in the West, at least in Britain at the moment and around the British Isles, in an economic downturn, possibly just on an upturn, but pretty much at the bottom of a wave at the moment. Is that part of the issue? Is that people think, well, yeah, I am interested, but obviously people are more worried about, well, will I have a job? Will I have an income? Can I heat my home? Will my children have a sort of a jobs to go to? Will they have decent schools to go to? All these sort of issues which presumably for a lot of people at least are closer to home maybe.
The bottom line is that we are part of nature, and we without nature we wouldn't exist. And so if we destroy it or grind it down till there's very little left of it, then we are going to be affected as well. So it doesn't really matter what the economic situation is. We still need to be looking after our nature. wildlife, wild plants and animals.
And it's important we do it on the local level, because again, if you look at, you only have to go on social media for 10 minutes, don't you, and look at sort of the naysayers who say, oh, it doesn't matter what we do here on the Isle of Man, we're so small, we're not going to have any impact on sort of the biodiversity of the planet as a whole. What would you say to naysayers who come up with that argument?
Well, we have to look after our own biodiversity. There's a moral argument as well as the economic and political one, but it's the value of nature for the services, what they call ecosystem services, has been demonstrated worldwide, and it applies to the Isle of Man just as much as anywhere else. It's pollination of crops, cleaning of water, and all the rest of it. I think, to answer sort of one of your previous questions, it's just not understood by people how essential this is, and how much we therefore need to look after it.
People have realised that climate emergency is significant now, I think, but they're not making the connection with the ecological emergency. What's happening is that we could be using ecological solutions, nature-based solutions to the climate problems. If we don't have a resilient environment on the Isle of Man, we knock out this species and that species, we're making ourselves very vulnerable to pest problems, breakdown of soil fertility, many different aspects if we can't look after the diversity that gives us that resilience.
And are the two interlinked? Because you mentioned there this sort of climate crisis, and I think everyone will have seen that in the news on a regular basis and the various COP meetings going on. As we speak, I think there is a COP meeting in Colombia going on, which is on biodiversity. Do the two get mixed up in people's minds, or would you say that they are very much coming from one and the same sort of argument?
I think they tended to be looked at separately. I think that's part of the problem. We really need to see them as part of supporting one another, the nature and the climate. It's no good saying, oh, well, we've got to have all this alternative energy, because if we don't have that, we'll have climate breakdown and therefore there will be no biodiversity. It's not as simple as that. I hear people say that. You've got to have all these developments for alternative energy in first, because we can't, without that, we aren't going to save the climate.
I think that's been recognised even by the chair of this current COP, who has said that the biodiversity crisis is as important to solve as the climate crisis, and the two are interlinked and interdependent, and you can't solve one without the other.
Getting down to the nitty-gritty of it then, so obviously there's the three of you talking today from fungi, and from obviously bats with you, Nick, and recording for many years and being involved in ecology, Philippa. Who else is or do you see being involved in the Alliance?
Well, the Wildlife Trust are involved in the Alliance. Manx BirdLife are involved in the Alliance.
The Bat Group.
Of course, the Bat Group and the Fungus Group, and individual ecologists. So we are a mix of organisations with a primary involvement in nature conservation, and ecologists with a concern about wildlife.
And so would you see the group, the M&A, will it be separate? Because you mentioned several of the groups which are well known on the Isle of Man. There's something like the Manx Wildlife Trust, which people might see as a sort of an umbrella organisation. How does it fit in with these other groups, or with groups like, say, the MWT?
Well, I'm not sure the Wildlife Trust is an umbrella organisation, and I think Manx Nature Alliance definitely is, and it's partly to demonstrate that there's a wider community of conservation-focused organisations and individuals whose opinions and voices ought to be listened to and respected in the overall debate.
So how do you see, Philippa, going forward then? How do you see the role of the Manx Nature Alliance when it comes to issues? We've been discussing things like biodiversity on the Isle of Man, loss of species and such like. What do you see its role as being? To highlight things, to work with government, to work with people? How will it work?
It's partly publicising issues that we're worried about, encouraging government to do the things that they are obliged legally to do, that they're not doing at the moment, which we can talk about shortly. and working together to provide information about the issues.
We have drawn up terms of reference and identified some priorities for the Alliance, and the top of the priorities is the need to address the protection of habitat and protected areas. We're also looking at the legislation, making sure the legislation is up to date. We haven't, for example, reviewed the lists of protected species since the mid 2000s, and they're normally done every 5 years in the UK. The biodiversity strategy is reaching the end of its 10-year life next year, and we're concerned about the lack of delivery on the first one that was written, which many of us were involved in. And we're particularly concerned about lack of resources to deliver these.
And you mentioned the biodiversity strategy there. So whose responsibility is that? Does that fall within DEF, or whose responsibility would it be to update that and come up with a new one?
It's DEFRA's responsibility.
It would be DEFRA.
Yes.
And so is this the issue? Will it be, do you see yourselves working or being a sort of a pressure group to actually pressurise or at least get government to focus more on these issues?
I think partly pressure group, but also to try and build support and make sure that politicians understand the issues and know that there's a great will and great interest, not just from the membership of these organisations and the Alliance, but as you say, when you look on social media, there are Manx Birds from My Window, and there's Manx Wildlife and Manx Biodiversity Facebook pages, and they've got a huge amount of support.
Now, you mentioned, Philippa, that there were issues that the government were obliged to do which needed to be addressed and weren't being addressed. Could you perhaps pick up on some of those?
Recently, there's been an independent review on wildlife designations for DEFRA. This was done by an organisation off the island, and they've just the DEFRA have just published it, circulated it to us. Tynwald recognised in 2022 that there was a biodiversity crisis, but at that time they didn't put any extra pennies at all into doing anything about it. They published a biodiversity report, but nothing, very little has been done. The Isle of Man is this has come from this independent review. The Isle of Man is woefully lacking in its international obligations. It's the worst jurisdiction in the UK, all 5 parts of the UK, and including the Isle of Man. Looking at them together, it's the worst one for wildlife legislation, designation of protected sites, monitoring, management and restoration of protected areas, and enforcement where things go wrong. Monitoring is particularly bad. So we really want to raise the political agenda on this, because nature just doesn't have a voice at the moment. Tynwald acknowledged in 2022 that the global biodiversity and ecological crisis, and it recommended its support of the island's 2015 biodiversity strategy, which aimed to manage biodiversity changes, to minimise loss of species and habitats, to maintain, restore and enhance native biodiversity, and to involve society in understanding and appreciating and safeguarding biodiversity. That was the declaration. The idea is by 2030 to conserve 30% of terrestrial land for nature conservation. And we've only done just over 4%. And of that 4%, we have only monitor about 0.2%. So it's a very, very small amount is actually certainly up to scratch, because these sites need to be looked after. You don't just leave them alone to look after themselves, because they need specialist management. I should have said the 0.2% is what's under a management agreement, where the government pays the landowner to do particular things, fencing or grazing or cutting or whatever needs doing to maintain the habitat in its best condition for the species that live there. Otherwise, you lose species. And I've brought along these 3, which are the species of conservation concern in the Isle of Man, which have been published between 2021 and 2024. Manx BirdLife published the birds one, and the Wildlife Trust have done one of plants of conservation concern and one of freshwater fish. And they show which species have gone extinct, which species are of severe conservation concern or are threatened.
Are we well off our targets then? From certainly what you're saying there, like looking for this 30%, we're well behind on that. Is there any hope that we can, I mean, obviously, ideally we'd like to see this accelerated somewhat, but I mean, presumably we're not going to hit these targets as they stand.
We're not going to hit very many of the targets in the biodiversity strategy, unfortunately, which is partly what we're trying to point out and encouraging greater progress than there currently is.
And what would you say, Liz, because obviously you were heavily involved back in your day working within the department then, and I could sort of see an argument saying, someone putting this forward and saying we're very low, we need to do more, and from a governmental department someone coming back and saying, I totally agree with you, we just haven't got the money, we haven't got the budgets. Yeah,
well, that's certainly been what's been said, and it's simply not a priority. The economy is far more important, and that's why we need to raise this up the agenda, because it quite simply cannot be just left. We have an international reputation. We've agreed to sign up to these agreements, and we're opening ourselves to international criticism by failing to deal with issues of site protection, invasive non-native species, and in the end there will be an economic cost to the failure to conserve nature. It's not an either or. We will open ourselves to really difficult problems of invasive species control or loss of income in certain sectors due to problems that have been based on the natural environment failing to provide the ecosystem services that we've been involved in.
I believe there's now evidence that the big companies, as part of their corporate compliance, are now looking for evidence of environmental compliance on that sort of international level. So there is a possibility it could even affect the decisions of big companies whether or not they want to relocate to somewhere like the Isle of Man that seems to be falling behind.
And do we need to get more people? I mean, is it about getting more people actually involved to put pressure on government? Is that the only way that change is going to happen? Or can we, ordinary citizens and people, whether they're members of the back group or the fungi group or the BirdLife or whatever, is there more that sort of ordinary people can do to help meet these targets? Or is it something that's more a case of really having to put the pressure on the authorities, and in this case DEFRA and the departments who are responsible for this, to actually be able to, or pressurise them to spend more money and be more active on this front?
I don't think we're expecting government to do everything, but clearly in the biodiversity strategy we said government needs to lead by example. I mean, this idea that government leading by example is just not it's just not happening.
Yeah, I think we have an education role, because people just aren't aware of some of these issues that we're talking about. The Wildlife Trust does a huge amount of education and outreach, and I just think that more is needed.
Mm-hmm. And do you think people get the biosphere enough? It's been around for a long time now. We've had biosphere status for a goodly number of years. It's always there, sort of in the background to a degree, but do you think people either know about it enough or care enough about the Isle of Man's biosphere status, particularly, again, as we were saying, in this sort of current climate? Or maybe they do care about it, but they're more worried again about things like the jobs, their economy, will they have enough money to pay their bills and such like, first and foremost?
I think the biosphere status has introduced a lot of confusion, to be honest. And people say, oh, we're a biosphere, everything must be hunky-dory. Whereas in actual fact, it's a very specific thing, which is the basic aim is for man and nature to be living together, because the island has this biosphere status. It's being used as a well, in my cynical moments, a marketing tool, and I think that's why certain of the groups that are supportive of it actually go along with it, because they see there's something in it for them, whereas it should be a give and take, man and nature living together, rather than just man taking what he wants from it.
I think it is definitely a matter of promoting the island. It's a means of promoting the island. It's like advertising the island in its fantastic environment.
The reason why we obtained biosphere reserve status is that little more than perhaps 20 years ago, round about that, we were actually doing really well because we had started the process of conserving sites, and we were able to show that we had a good biodiversity at that time. But it's not something that's, you have to keep working at it. Mm-hmm. And since then, it's gone downhill, and we probably don't deserve biosphere status now in terms of our actual wildlife species and conservation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So going forward then, obviously this is a newly organised group, the Manx Nature Alliance. How do you see it going forward from here? I mean, is it something where will you sort of have regular meetings? Will you bring other groups together to sort of try and speak with one voice? How do you actually see it operating going forward over the next weeks and months?
Well, we don't want to get involved in the nitty-gritty stuff, commenting on planning applications. That there are already organisations who are handling that side of things. So we're looking at it at the higher policy level. And we have the model of a wildlife and countryside link in the UK, and one of the things they do is position statements, and we may want to make position statements about things that we're concerned about, so backed up with the statistics about the decline and drawing attention to the things that need to be done.
And in the meantime, anyone listening to the podcast, hearing more or hearing about the Manx Nature Alliance, people who might think, that's interesting, I'd like to find out more. Is there a website or is an address or someone could speak to if they wanted to find out more about the M&A and its work?
We have an email address for the M&A, and I can provide that. It's Manx Nature Alliance at outlook.com.
Perhaps we should say at this point, as you say, there's an email address there, Liz, as you say, but also there will be the link to the Manx Nature Alliance on all the other groups we mentioned, like the likes of Manx BirdLife, Manx Wildlife Trust. If people go to their websites, they'll be able to see the actual information from the Manx Nature Alliance there.
Yep.
Best of luck with this. Hopefully we can reconvene perhaps in a few weeks, a few months' time to see how things are going. But for the time being, Liz, Nick, Philippa, thanks very much for having a chat with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.